Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World, and I'm going to continue my discussion of God. This is part 2. I expect there'll be a part 3, maybe a part 4. I didn't do any cooking on Tuesday, but here at least is an image of my leek and mushroom pie. It's just like a cottage pie, except it's leek and mushrooms in the filling. And I changed it up a little bit by putting some cheese in the mashed potato. It's a very complicated vegetarian dish. Quite delightful in a lot of ways. No need for a recipe. Leek and mushrooms, make a gravy, make some mashed potatoes, put it on top, bake in the oven, and serve. So what I really want to talk about today are different viewpoints on God, and particularly on atheism, what theism really entails and what atheism entails. So let's get started. Now things can get very complicated very quickly when we talk about God and theism and atheism and whatnot. I'd like to try to keep things as simple as I can without oversimplifying. I mean, obviously, theism comes from the Greek root of theos for God, and atheism also has a Greek root where a is not. So a theist believes in the existence of at least one God, and an atheist does not believe in the existence of a God. All right, well, that is already complicated because we have to start talking about what God is, which I didn't do last time quite deliberately, and I'll get into that eventually. So I'm going to broaden things out a little bit and talk not just about God, but about the concept of the supernatural. Now, you can believe in a supernatural world without necessarily believing in God, or you can deny the supernatural exists. Like, the etymology is very simple: supernatural, above super, natural, above nature, or outside of nature. And nature here means physical. So do you believe in something existing that has no physical reality? And that's actually a very complicated question. From a common sense point of view, you can say, well, of course I believe that things exist that are not physical, not, we say, tangible, like beauty, for example. Beauty doesn't have a tangible existence by itself, or even an idea or a dream. They are, at least on a common sense point of view, non-material. Well, there, unfortunately, philosophers can sometimes disagree. There are some philosophers, we'll call them materialists, who believes that everything that we think of as intangible is actually the product of the physical world. And I'll get into that a little bit more later on. But when we talk normally about the supernatural, we're not just talking about things that are non-material. We're talking about things like God, or perhaps leprechauns or fairies or ghosts or some other non-physical entity which nonetheless has some reality. So our first task is to decide whether we're going to accept the existence of the supernatural or not. And another task that we're going to have to confront is whether the supernatural is only the realm of God or whether it's a much broader realm. In the stuff I was talking about in the last video, I mentioned the fact that in the book of Job, it opens with God in his court with his various courtiers around him, angels and archangels, and that the Satan comes along and confronts him. And in Hebrew, the Satan literally means, I'll call it the devil's advocate, if you like. The adversary is its technical translation. Somebody who opposes God. That's his job. Like God says, this is good, and the adversary says, no, it's bad. So, have you seen my servant Job? He's a good man. Yes, but if you do certain things, you'll find out he's not very good. Blah, blah, blah. That's the whole book of Job. So a lot of Christians in particular believe that there's a whole heavenly court made up of all seraphim, cherubim, all of that. And that's all supernatural, but that's not God. And so we have to, first of all, decide whether we think that there is anything that is supernatural. And for me, that's actually a difficult question. In fact, I'm going to hold off on that. When I say that I believe that God exists, I don't necessarily believe that God is supernatural. Now things start to get complicated. So I mentioned last time a couple of very common perceptions of God. One is as emperor of the universe, and another one is as father figure. And I mentioned that I don't find either particularly useful interpretations of what God is, for all kinds of reasons. They satisfy needs that people have. Some people need authority figures, and whether that authority figure is an emperor or a father, they need or want that in their lives, and God fills that. Now, what I want to make clear, and in some very, very early videos, almost a year ago, I mentioned that I'm not happy with the idea of God as an entity that fills a void of any sort. There's a concept of the God of the gaps, so that when people didn't understand how it rained, or what formed rainbows, or why things fell to the ground, or whatever, they said, well, God did it. And the God of the gaps hypothesis, which is proposed by celebrity atheists like Richard Dawkins, suggests that as science grows more and more sophisticated and more knowledgeable, that God shrinks more because there's less for him to account for. And in those videos that I made, a long time ago, I said that I don't accept that either, that the idea of God as explaining things that we can't explain in other ways, I also find that a useless concept of God. That there's all kinds of reasons that people place qualities on God, whether it be as role model or father figure, authority figure, replacement for science, whatever. I find all of those ideas unreasonable, and I don't want them. I don't need to invent a God to explain something that I can't explain. I'll search for explanations, or I'll leave them unexplained. That is not, for me, a useful way of thinking about God. But I want to talk a little bit more about the concept of the physical and the non-physical, because that's a really important area. So one of the questions that has come up in philosophy for over 2,000 years is the question of where the mind exists, where ideas exist, and where the desire to do something actually resides. Like when you decide to move your arm, what happens first? If it's an act of will, where is that act of will? Does it exist? And many, many philosophers have created the philosophical concept of mind. That is, we have a mind, and it's this non-material thing that has ideas, has dreams, has a will, and then the body acts based on the will. So I will to raise my arm, and then my arm raises. What is the connection between the mind, which is non-physical, and the body, or in this particular case, first of all, the brain? What is the connection between the mind and the brain? Because we can look at the physical structure of the brain, and we can see what's happening when I raise my arm. We can look and we can see neurons firing, we can see biochemical reactions and so forth. We can see all that happening. But where is the will to do it? Is it just these physical neurons and chemistry, or is there something else? And philosophers like René Descartes, for example, said that there is a non-material mind, and then there is a physical brain, and they interact. But then the question becomes, how do they interact? How does the immaterial create the physics and the chemistry and biochemistry of the brain? How does that happen? Where is the mind operating? Where is it? And Descartes didn't really have a very good answer. He had an answer, but not a very good one. But his viewpoint is called dualist. Dual, like two. So there's two things. There's the immaterial world, and then there's the material world. And the mind-body problem, as it's called, is how does the immaterial work on the material? Well, one solution, which is elegant, I guess, but not very satisfying, is to say that the immaterial doesn't exist, that the mind does not exist. It's an illusion, that what exists is the physical brain and the physical world, and everything else that happens that we experience, ideas, dreams, thoughts and so forth, that's just an illusion. And people who believe that are called materialists. And for a long, long time, we had to make a choice. Are you going to be a materialist or are you going to be a dualist? And the materialists, by and large, were also atheists. Like, if God is this non-material, transcendent, whatever you want to call him, thing, those things don't exist, therefore God doesn't exist. Whereas a dualist can say, well, there are immaterial things, non-material things, and they can act on the material world, and God is a non-material thing. Don't necessarily have to describe God in great detail, but we have to accept that there is a non-material realm, and God is part of that realm. Well, there is a third way. And that is the way that I'm going to talk about probably in the next video, I expect. There is a third way which argues that things like ideas, thoughts, those things that the dualist wants to put into an immaterial world, those things are actually qualities of the material world, and we don't understand them very well. And I'm not going to explain them very well right now, but I'm just going to give you a simple example. When I was teaching in Myanmar, I had some middle school students who were studying light, and we talked about how colors are perceived, how when white light shines on a red object, for example, the colors of the spectrum, the visible spectrum, are mostly absorbed, but the red wavelengths are reflected, and they're reflected into our eyes, and we have cones in our eyes that recognize redness, and we see red. And this is going to be significant for a later video, so pay attention. And what I could not get them to understand was that the red object is not intrinsically red. It's red is our perception. So they would say, for example, I said, for example, okay, like I'm wearing a white shirt. Or, sorry, I have to be a little bit more precise. I have a shirt which appears white in white light. What color does it appear if I shine blue light on it? And they would say, blue, okay, no problem. But then they wanted to say, but it's really white. So they're getting at something which we call essentialist. They're saying that there's some essential whiteness to the shirt, but it appears blue because of the blue light. Now that's a philosophical mistake, because the color of the object is not intrinsic to the thing. The color is a perception based on the light shining on the object, certain qualities of the surface of the object, and the nature of our eyes. It's not intrinsic in the thing itself. And they had enormous problems with that. I understand they were 13 years old, and I probably would have had the same problem when I was 13. In fact, I still sometimes struggle with that idea too, the idea that color is not in the thing, that color is a sensation in our eyes created by the light by the surface of the object and what's reflected from that surface. That's a very, very difficult concept to grasp. So one of the simple resolutions of the so-called mind-body problem is rather akin to what you might think of as the color object problem. That is, I'm saying that color is not intrinsic to an object, but it is a quality of that object that appears under certain conditions. And what some people are arguing is that mind is like color. Like mind is a quality of the brain that appears under certain conditions. It's not immaterial any more than color is immaterial. It can be described in all kinds of ways. But it's not just the material substrate of the brain. It is something else. I know I'm getting way, way too deep too quickly. But here's the thing. The whole argument hinges on whether you believe that consciousness exists. And most of us just by intuition or by simple reasonableness will say, well, of course, I'm conscious of myself, I'm self-aware, I have subjective experiences. Now, materialists will say, well, that's just an illusion. You are having chemical reactions, neurons are firing in the brain, and you have an illusion of subjective experience, but it's not really there. Well, I don't like that, but I will conclude with this one point. And I'll talk about all of these issues more in the third video. That what happens philosophically and even scientifically is that people get rooted in certain ways of thinking, and they get stuck there and argue about those things to the end of time. And as I was saying in the last video, then you end up wasting your time. That is, if I sit down with an ardent materialist who claims that experience is an illusion, and I claim that my subjective experience is real, we're not going to get anywhere. So all I'm going to be able to do in subsequent videos is to give you my position, which I think is reasonable and intuitively strong, but I don't have the monopoly on truth. And there are holes in my belief system, but there are also holes in dualism, there are holes in materialism too. And I'll point those out as well. So meanwhile, if this rambling has appealed to you, then like and subscribe, and I will see you on Tuesday for more rambling, mostly about the nature of consciousness.